In this video, we're going to talk about parent function. Parent functions are the simplest function in a function family. We spent most of Algebra 2 studying function families. For our purposes in pre-calculus, you should be able to recognize which family a function belongs to. We're going to start learning more about transformations of parent functions, but I just want you to be able to recognize each of the parent functions. So when you have a function that is just equal to a constant, sometimes called a constant function, that just means that the function is equal to just one value the whole entire time it exists on its whole domain. So you can see this function here, the value of this function is always 1, no matter where we are on the domain. There are many other constant functions for literally any other number. The parent function is the simplest form of that function. So the simplest form of the constant function is just y equals 1. The next function we learn a lot about is not listed here. Let me type it in real quick. That would be the linear function. So the simplest form of a linear function is a linear function with a slope of 1. So when you go up 1, you go over 1, and a y-axis, or y-intercept of 0. So you might be used to seeing this is y equals mx plus b. In this case, m is 1 and b is 0. So this is a linear function. This is the simplest form of the linear function. So the simplest possible y-intercept would be a y-intercept of 0. The simplest possible slope would be a slope of 1. The next function we study a lot in Algebra 2 is the quadratic function. The quadratic function comes from two x's being multiplied. So whatever the value of x is, you multiply it by itself to get the y coordinate. Quadratic function is nicely symmetrical. So on this side, it's 2, 4. On this side, it's negative 2, 4. It has a vertex. It has an axis of symmetry. Like I said, it's symmetrical. It's the same on each side. Quadratic functions, we spent a lot of time on. We talked about the quadratic formula. We talked about factoring. But for our purposes now, whenever we see a parabola, we should recognize that it is the quadratic function. The simplest form of the parabola, the parent function for the quadratic, is y equals x squared. So it has a vertex of 0, 0. You can continue to add powers, sometimes called power functions. For our purposes, I would like you to also be able to recognize x cubed. Beyond that, we're not going to stress too much. So this is called the cubic function. These are all in the kind of bigger umbrella of polynomials. So all of these are polynomials. And polynomials have different degrees, which tell you a little bit about the shape of the polynomials. I'm spelling it incorrectly. Which tell you a little bit about the shape of the graph dependent on the degree. So for a cubic function, again, the simplest one is just y equals x to the 3rd power. It has this little twist here at 0, 0, and then it goes both off in either direction. Next function that we've studied a lot in Algebra 2 is the exponential function. So an exponential function, it's hard to get a parent function here. So again, in the simplest version, we would usually go with 1, right? For all these others, you can see that if you had to multiply by a number, it would be 1. If you had to add a number, it would be 0. But here, an exponential, we really can't start with 1 because you're multiplying, and 1 times 1 is still 1. So we generally go with y equals 2 to the x power as our parent function for our exponential. An exponential function has an asymptote. That it is constantly, as it goes to the left here, it is constantly getting closer and closer and closer to. An asymptote kind of pulls the graph in towards it. Again, we should recognize what the parent function of the exponential looks like. Differently than these others, this base also could change. So there's kind of lots of different parent functions depending on what the base of your exponential is. That is actually similar for the logarithmic function. Hopefully you remember a little bit about logs from last year. A logarithm is the inverse of an exponential function. This parent function that I gave here, you'll notice, you might remember from logarithms, or you may not, that logarithms also, because they are the inverse of an exponential, they would also have a base, so connected to what the base was. In this case, when there is no base written, that means that it is a log base 10. So often called the common log. When no base is written. we say it is a base of 10. A logarithmic function, because it's the inverse of the exponential, we've switched the x's and the y's, and it has an asymptote that is vertical along the y-axis. So again, as this function moves to the left, it gets infinitely closer to the y-axis. Finally, the last function in our function family that you should recognize is the rational function. Rational function looks a little maybe similar to your exponential and your logarithm. It is different. A rational function actually has both of these pieces. So both of these two separate pieces make up the graph of the rational function. And it has two asymptotes, one that is vertical up and down and one that is horizontal straight across. As I said at the start of the video, your goal would be that if you were to see a graph, a constant, a linear, a quadratic, you would recognize which it was. And really that's kind of all for now. So you would recognize which family that it belonged to.